Hi everyone, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. I'm in a slightly different area of my office right now. Earlier today, I took Mariah to a new daycare that she's gonna be starting tomorrow, and I spent like all day on the floor. Like, you know, we just went to like check it out and they observed her and everything. So I was just like on the floor with babies all day, and I'm just kind of in that zone right now. And then also my other camera that is usually set up on the tripod, that battery is not charged, but this one is. So you are sitting on top of a stack of many books. I'm just curious how many, hold on. 24 books. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 right here. There are just books everywhere. And I thought today we would talk about some of the books that I have read lately. I had a really weird September and October. So this is kind of a September, October wrap up, but then also talk about like why I chose each one and like why I kind of stuck with them. Because I start a lot more books than I finish. So all around here are stacks of books that I've read like half of or a few chapters of, and I just haven't made my way through them yet. So we'll talk about the ones that I read and why I read them. I feel like for some people who are, you know, trying to get back into reading, do a little bit more reading, it's just hard to know what to read. For my students, for my 7th graders, that's, I don't know if it's just a time wasting device, but, or at least they like have that in their head. They're like, well, I don't know what to read. And so they just like walk around and look at my shelves like, I don't know what I want to read. Even though we have like so many recommendations and so many different ways to get that information to them. But anyways, let me tell you what I've been reading lately. So September, how much I read in a certain month tells me a lot about the month. So I only read 1 book in the month of September. September was really just like busy and crazy. We were all back at school. That was the month of the Dr. Phil show taping. That was actually like a ton of time on our end. So I didn't get to read very much. I only read 1 book, and I actually moved it to my school shelf, but it's called Living with Viola by Rosanna Fung. Just put it up here for you. But this one, the way that I like found out about it is that I saw it on Instagram. I know I saw it on Donut Lovin' Teacher's Instagram, and I think somebody else's. So sometimes when you just see something, you know, like maybe like the 2nd or 3rd time you see it, you're like, okay, yeah, this looks interesting. So it's a graphic novel, and I wanted to read more graphic novels that I could recommend to my students. And it is for like middle grades. I think the character in the book is maybe like 6th grade or 7th grade. So it's perfect for my students. This character lives in Canada and she's Chinese. And she's just like going through middle school and going through like family situations and trying to figure out how to navigate those with also like this really loud voice of anxiety. And so since it's a graphic novel, you get to see like this other version of herself constantly telling her the worst possible outcome of every situation and like why she shouldn't do something and like how everybody is thinking about how dumb she is. And even as you like read through the story, it's really disruptive to the story, right? You're like, like you just want this other one to go away. You don't want that voice in her mind. But I think it does a really good job of addressing, you know, anxiety and some mental health issues in younger students, and like how embarrassing it can feel to go to your parents or your family, especially if you feel like that's gonna be like a source of shame for the family. Like if the talk that you hear around mental health or people who are struggling is really negative, then you don't want to like add to that. So I thought, you know, everything that it brings up was really powerful. So yeah, I've recommended it to my students. I think I'm gonna make sure to share it like with the counselors as well, because I could see this being a really helpful book. Okay, so that one I read because I saw it recommended by like trusted people on Instagram, and then also I just thought that this could be something that was useful for my students. So that motivated me to read it. The next book, kind of the same reasons. And this one is also now in my classroom. So this one is called Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia. And I have seen this one recommended on like Instagram and YouTube for a long time. So it was on my radar, I knew about it. And this one is not a graphic novel, but like a little bit. It's kind of a graphic novel. And that's only because the main character in the story, Eliza, she is like an online web comic artist. So she draws these web comics like every week, like a little bit more of the story comes out, but she's anonymous. And so people online are like huge fans of her work, but they don't actually know who she is. So sometimes throughout the book, you get to see like sketches that she is working on to put up like on her site. So it's really interesting to read a book from the perspective of somebody. She's a senior in high school. So, you know, this book is geared towards older students than living with Viola. But yeah, she's a senior and she doesn't really fit in at school. She feels kind of invisible there, which is such a common trope, you know, in so many books set in high school. But it's kind of like that superhero trope almost, because she is anonymous and she kind of lives in this other world where people totally know who she is and they are like obsessed with her. So she's kind of living this double life. And, you know, I live a lot of my life online as well. And it can be weird to try to like explain things to other people who don't have that experience, and like explain like why you would kind of sacrifice things in the real world to like make sure that you like get something posted on time, or to like reply to comments, or even just like making friends with other people who you've never actually met in real life, but you have connected over this like common interest. I know what that feels like. So it's kind of interesting to read it from the perspective of somebody so much younger. This, you know, like 17, 18, and her parents really can't understand and they want her to get off her phone and get off her computer, engaged in the real world. And she's like, this is my real life, and it's hard for them to understand that. But she also has like anxiety and depression, and she does use this escape into an online world to avoid dealing with her problems in the real world. So it can be both, you know, you can have like this healthy relationship with social media or like online platforms, but then at the same time use them to distract yourself from dealing with things in your real life. So I thought this was another really good one for students that talks about mental health issues. So again, I think I should recommend this one to our counselors. Okay, the rest of them I have here. So I didn't actually read the copy of this book. I listened to it on audiobook. So I bought this book, I mean, like early in lockdown, I feel like. I think I've had this for quite a while. Everybody was talking about it on social media for a bit there. So this is called Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell, and I listen to his podcast all the time, Revisionist History. I've listened to it for years. So I bought the book, but then I would catch like bits of his podcast on NPR, and he was talking about how the audiobook version is really what you want to listen to, because like anytime they do an interview or something like that, there's like sound from that actual person. So I kind of have mixed feelings about the audiobook, because they did play a lot of it just like on NPR. Like I heard several chapters already. So like when I got to those sections, I was like, oh yeah, I've heard like a pretty good chunk of this already. So I felt kind of dumb having paid for it on Audible. But I ended my Audible subscription. I had like 1 credit left, and so I was like, oh, let me see, like what should I get? Like, oh, I remember Malcolm Gladwell saying this was like way better to listen to on audio. So okay, let me listen to this. In the very beginning, like 7th grade world history teachers, there's a section about first encounters of like Cortez and Montezuma. And this would be a really good section if you know, had it on audiobook to play for your students. It's just like very, very well done. The rest of it, I was surprised, was very not kid friendly. Like this book is about how bad we are at talking to strangers, and it begins and ends with the story of Sandra Bland, who was arrested illegally, really, and then she committed suicide in her cell after a really, really bad interaction with the police. So I thought that the ending was the most interesting, when he actually talked about like policing and the way that police are trained and the way that they think that solving crimes or preventing crimes happens, and it requires like being very suspicious of everyone. And then most of the book before that is just about like the way that we like default to truth, and we are not very good at being able to tell like when someone is lying, and we also like don't have a good sense of what it actually looks like when someone is telling the truth. Like it doesn't necessarily look the way that it does on TV, and sometimes people are just kind of awkward and stumble over their words, and then we think that they're lying, we think that they're untrustworthy, but they're not. That's just who they are. So it's interesting, but it does this through the stories of just like all these really awful like rapes and cases of abuse, and like this was something I could not listen to loudly with my kids around. Like it was very triggering for me too. Like almost everything in this book is just like, oh my gosh, like this is hard to listen to. So it was just different than I thought it would be, but not very different from his podcast, and not as like groundbreaking as I thought. But it did leave me with like a lot of things to think about, and you know, ideas that are kind of rolling around in my head. But it's not one that I'm gonna be like keeping on my shelf that I would reference again. So I'll probably give this away, but I still love Malcolm Gladwell, and I actually need to read even more of his books. There's still a lot that are on my list just because I really like him, and I like his podcast, and I like the way that he interviews people, and I like the way that he like approaches questions and approaches problems in our society, and he does that very well in this book. So it was kind of the author himself that really got me to listen to that one. The next book that I read is called Audacity by Melanie Crowder. And so a couple of years ago, my students did literature circles with books about like the Industrial Revolution, along with Emily from Read It, Write It, Learn It with her classes. And so it's been a couple years since we did it because of the panini, and so we're trying to get back into it this year. And Liddy was the one book that like nobody ever really wanted to read, and so Emily added this book into the rotation. It's called Audacity, and this one's actually a novel in verse. This section was really cool, the stacks of books, and it's about a girl who is a Jewish immigrant to New York, and her experience working in factories and then trying to get her fellow workers to unionize. A good portion of the book takes place back in Russia, where she's from, and shows like why they had to leave. And so I liked that part of it. I think that is really different from the other books that are in this set of literature circle books. And I have a lot of other videos on this topic if you want to check those out. The only thing is that it really makes it seem like it's about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and it isn't. Like it's got a flame on the front, like all of the sections are named with like fire metaphors, like tinder and heat and flame or whatever, but it's not about that, which is kind of good because several of the other books in our literature circles are about the fire itself. So this one isn't. I don't get why it's like totally marketed that way. But she does work in like horrible conditions, and she is trying to unionize at the same time with those same people, and it's based on the story of a real person. So it's really, really good. I loved it. I haven't recommended it to my students yet because I want to use it in literature circles. Why is that so hard to say? Literature circles? Lit circles. So I'm just kind of holding on to it for that. But yes, I read it because I want to use it in class, and I was just double checking to make sure I really do. The next book that I read, this was because I love the author. Celeste Ng has written some of my favorite works of fiction, favorite novels. And actually I remember, gosh, a couple of years ago, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, because honestly I did not used to read this much. I was in grad school for a long time, and I had to do tons of reading for that. And then like after I was finally done with my master's, I was kind of like taking a break from reading. I'm like, oh my gosh, I just need to like never read another book again. And then one day my husband brought home 2 Celeste Ng books. What are they, like All the Things I Never Told You and like Little Fires Everywhere. I think those are the titles. And I read them like so quickly. Like he heard about them on NPR, I guess, and he just thought that I would like them. So he just brought them home to me. And that's what got me like re-energized to read again. Like ever since reading those 2 books like 5 years ago, ever since then I have just like picked up speed with my reading and like gotten even more into it. So when I found out that Celeste Ng was coming out with a new book, this one's called Our Missing Hearts, I definitely had to get it. I hate the cover. I just think this is so ugly. I don't understand. I mean, like I kind of get it, like what, you know, the feather and the birds are supposed to symbolize from reading the book, but it's just so ugly. I don't like it at all. After this video, I'm gonna take off the cover, but I will keep it because this book is kind of like a dystopian novel. It's kind of similar to like Fahrenheit 451 or 1984, Handmaid's Tale, The Giver, like books like that. And I think this is gonna be a classic. Like, it's only been out for a couple months, but I think this one will be required reading in high schools. So the difference between this book and some of the other ones is that it's this dystopia, but it, like, race is front and center in like the discourse. Like, the people in this book who are not trusted are people of Asian origin. So the world is very familiar. They've gone through something called a crisis, which is kind of like our pandemic, and then like this current financial crisis that we're going through. And the people in this America, you know, have decided that it was China's fault and China is to blame for all of our problems. And so anyone who looks Asian is like held in suspicion, and people feel like we should have like protected American values better. So they pass legislation to protect like American traditions. And if you are seen as somebody who doesn't protect American traditions well enough, or you kind of rebel against this in any way, they take your kids because they don't feel like you are fit to be raising American children. So that's really what like drives the plot. It's what stops everybody from, you know, fighting back against this government because they don't want their children to be taken from them. But then there are some people whose children are pretty much going to be taken from them no matter what, and then they have nothing to lose, and so then they are fighting back against this. And what makes this book so creepy is that all of the tactics that they use in this fictional book are things that the American government has used against people. We took Native American children, indigenous children away from their families, saying that their families weren't fit to raise them to become American enough, so we would send them to these boarding schools where they would often die in, you know, just tragically high numbers. And enslaved women were constantly being separated from their children and their families. Children at the border being separated from their families. And so this is not a fictional tactic. This is something that does happen. So this is a book that I would like want to read again, and again, I feel like it's gonna be required reading at some point, unless we follow the path of this book where there is more book banning and libraries taking things off the shelves and keeping them out of the hands of our nation's youth so as not to corrupt them and turn them against the government or whatever. So anyway, I highly recommend this one. I was motivated to read it because it's by Celeste Ng, and it did not disappoint. The next one, I was at the library with Jensen, and he likes to go like use the computers there sometimes, and we'll borrow some books. And the computers are right by like the middle grades section, and it's fun to see all of the middle grades books in person because I see so many like on Instagram, or they're like recommended to me on Amazon or whatever, but it's nice to just like see them in person. I had never seen this one anywhere before. It's called 7 Voyages, How China's Treasure Fleet Conquered the Sea. I ended up buying my own copy because I need to return the library's copy, but I was like, well, this is really interesting. It's not super long, and this is a topic I don't know very much about. And as you might know, I have written my own like middle grades history books, and then in my research for my book, I read so many really good history books designated for that age group. So I actually kind of love reading history books that are supposed to be for that age group because the research is there in the good ones anyway, right? And you really do get like a pretty complete look at whatever the topic is, and they're relying on their primary sources and they provide their secondary sources, and they, you know, they really like follow all of the methodologies and stuff that you're supposed to do with a history book. But it's a little bit easier to get through it when it's written for, you know, people who are in middle school. So honestly, for adults, I highly recommend like reading these, not necessarily like picture book, kid book histories, but you know, like something like this is really, really good. I learned so much about China in the early 1400s. This is what students do in 7th grade in California. So if I ever taught 7th grade, it would be this. I do 6th grade, so it's like ancient. It's like before year 0. So this is like the early 1400s, and China had massive, massive seafaring capabilities at the beginning of the 1400s. So not like 1492, like Columbus. And they had huge ships and way more resources and way better like navigational technology. And they had these floating cities, and they sailed all over like Asia and Indonesia and into like India, Syria, and areas of the Middle East, and traded and established all of these amazing trade networks. Fascinating to learn about this, and just especially because we're always taught that like, oh my gosh, the Europeans like figured out shipbuilding and navigation and tried to establish trade routes. That had already been done for a long, long time. And it was mostly by there's a lot in here on Chinese eunuchs. Like I didn't realize that was such a huge thing. Like every emperor would have like thousands of eunuchs at his service, and really terrifying to think about. It's just how things were back then, I guess. Still very traumatizing, but yeah, so that, you know, their assistants couldn't ever like establish a dynasty of their own and weren't a threat to them in any way or to their concubines. They had thousands of eunuchs, and so this guy Zheng He was just an amazing sea captain and established these trade routes and had, you know, his navy fleet and everything. So it's just crazy. I think this book is really well done. The only things that I feel like were huge oversights, I don't understand why it's not in here. There's not a map of where they sailed to. Like they have a really crappy map in the beginning, but this doesn't even list like the places that they talk about. And some of like the cities that they talk about in this book don't really exist in the same way that they did back then. So they absolutely should have sprung for somebody to draw a map of what they were talking about in this book. I don't understand why they didn't do that. And then I also don't understand why they didn't provide just a little pronunciation guide after every name that they introduced, because most people don't know Chinese pronunciation. I only know a little bit because my students correct me anytime I try to say anything in an American accent. Like, I don't know if I'm saying Zheng He correctly, but a lot of Americans are gonna say Zheng He, and I know that is not correct. So they should have provided a pronunciation little thing after all of the names and stuff, and like the names of the empires and everything, because then you're gonna have like kids who get excited and read this book and then run around saying completely incorrect pronunciations. So those two things would have made this book much, much better. But the writing itself and the research itself and just like the story itself is very, very good. So if you teach like 7th grade history in California, this like world history where you're doing China in the 1400s, read this book. It's short, it doesn't take very long, and it's amazing, and I'm really glad I just grabbed it randomly from the library. The last book that I read in October was The Sentence by Louise Erdrich, and I have been wanting to read this book for well over a year. Whenever it came out, I know I like saw it all over my Instagram for a long time, but it's a book that's set in an independent bookstore. It's set in Birchbark Books, which Louise Erdrich owns, but the main character in the book is somebody fictional who works in the bookstore. But then Louise Erdrich shows up in the book every so often, just like a couple of times. So it's kind of weird, but I just knew that I had to purchase this from an independent bookstore. So one time I went to one of my favorite bookstores in Long Beach. I made a special trip and then they didn't have it. And so recently I went to my favorite bookstore in Pasadena and I bought it there, but I just like refused to buy it from Amazon. But again, Louise Erdrich is another one of my favorite authors, along with like Celeste Ng. Malcolm Gladwell's up there as well. He does nonfiction. But I knew I just needed her book because I love all of her books and I just wanted to buy it in the right way. But it takes place just before the pandemic, like near the Twin Cities. And so you get all of the characterization and the plot and everything of this family and then this like group of people who are living in like Minnesota in 2019, 2020. Then within the book, the pandemic hits and you see what it's like for them to go through that. And when George Floyd is murdered, that's right near them. So you're seeing all of these events that we recently went through unfold through the eyes of people who live very near everything and people who are also marginalized and have been historically mistreated by the police. Although the main character, Tuki, her husband was like part of the tribal police force, so he feels a little bit different than like his wife and his daughter slash niece that comes to stay with them. You know, he's a little bit less quick to just be angry at the police all the time. He has a little bit more of a sense of like, you know, what that job entails. So it's really interesting to like also have that perspective. And then throughout all of this, Tuki works at the bookstore at Birch Bark Books, and it's haunted by this white lady who was like obsessed with everything Indian. There's a lot of white people in this book who like show up and try to like talk to all these Indian people about Indian things, and like they have like bones and just like these relics and stuff, and they always expect them to be like so grateful, you know. And another kind of like sub theme of this book is just like the way that we handle the dead. So you've got the haunting, of course, but then like Tuki actually spent time in prison for something that she did, not even realizing that it was a crime. Like, I won't ruin everything, but it has to do with a dead body. And then there's so many white people who talk about like the bones of these dead bodies, and they do some research into what like scientists and other people did with the dead bodies of indigenous people, and how that can haunt you, you know. So it's so good. I love everything that Louise Erdrich does. This one is less of a murder mystery. Like, quite a few of her books are murder mysteries, and I love those. So probably I'm kind of in the mood for another one of her murder mysteries. There's so many. I just have like an endless supply of Louise Erdrich novels, thank goodness. And it's also not really like so epic. Like, some of her books cover like several families for like several generations, and so this one is a little bit more like focused in on just like one family and like one little community during a pretty short period of time. And there's not really a murder mystery, but there is a haunting. So yeah, it's a little bit different. It's like funny. It's just a really funny book despite the very serious themes, and you don't have to have read like her other books in order to understand this one. So this would be a good introduction into Louise Erdrich if you haven't read her before, I think. Okay, so that's it. That's the 7 that I read over September and October. October was definitely a month where I was really trying to like escape from reality. So I read what, 6 in October because I didn't want to think about everything that was going on. Generally, if it's a month where I have read a lot, it's because I didn't want to deal with anything that was happening in my real life. It's been a very, very stressful month. Just this whole like daycare situation has been just immensely stressful. And I've been out, you know, I haven't been at work for like a week. Me and Derek have been kind of going off and on, but so also I just had more time to read. So there's that. But anyway, I would love to know from you, like, what is something that like makes you go check out a book or buy a book, or, you know, pick this one up. Like, I have so many here right in front of me. I have another stack over there. Most of these I've read, I guess, but I have so many stacks of ones that I haven't read. So like, you know, how do I choose the next one? Sometimes that's like half the battle. Just like, okay, now what should I jump to next? Anyway, I will link all of these down below. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today on my floor. I'm gonna go check on this baby and do some cleaning. I really don't want to clean, but it is a disaster in that living room. I could just read and avoid it, but okay. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.